Imagine a war that started with handshakes and ended with helicopters being pushed into the ocean. The Vietnam War reads like a tragic comedy where everyone thought they were the hero, but nobody could agree on what the story was actually about. If you're enjoying this deep dive into history, smash that like button and hit subscribe. We're bringing you the untold stories that shaped our world, and your support helps us keep digging into the fascinating tales history forgot to mention. Back in 1858, the French rolled into Vietnam like uninvited dinner guests who insist on rearranging your furniture. They claimed they were bringing civilization to Vietnam. You know, the same civilization that had survived for thousands of years without their help. The French built roads and bridges, which sounds nice until you realize they were mainly for moving troops and resources out of the country. The Vietnamese weren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat. They'd dealt with unwanted visitors before. The Chinese had tried this same game for centuries, but the French were particularly stubborn guests who simply wouldn't take the hint and leave. Here's where our story gets interesting. In 1919, a young Vietnamese man showed up in Paris with a petition. This wasn't just any petition. It was a polite request for Vietnam's independence, signed by Vietnamese patriots who figured, hey, America talks about freedom all the time, maybe they'll help us out. The man who carried this petition would eventually be known as Ho Chi Minh, though he went through about 70 different names during his career. Imagine trying to keep track of your social media accounts if you changed your username that often. The petition made it to President Wilson's secretary, who promised to show it to the boss. That promise had about as much weight as a politician's campaign pledge. It never happened. Ho Chi Minh spent 30 years in exile, during which time he discovered Lenin's writings and thought, you know what? This communism thing might be the ticket to kicking out these colonial powers. It's funny how being ignored by one superpower can drive you straight into the arms of another. Fast forward to World War II, and suddenly everyone's priorities shifted. The Japanese occupied Vietnam, and guess who the Americans decided to support? That's right, Ho Chi Minh and his guerrilla fighters, whom he proudly called the Viet American Army. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a bayonet. The American OSS, the grandfather of the CIA, supplied Ho Chi Minh with weapons and training. The Americans were impressed with how quickly the Vietnamese learned to use their equipment. Ho Chi Minh even praised America as a champion of democracy. If only they could see what was coming next. On September 2, 1945, the same day Japan surrendered, Ho Chi Minh stood before hundreds of thousands of people in Hanoi and declared Vietnam independent. The crowd was electric with hope. Finally, after decades of colonial rule, Vietnam would be free. But here's where the comedy turns tragic. President Roosevelt, who had championed the idea of self-governing nations, was dead. Harry Truman now sat in the Oval Office, staring at a world map that looked like a giant chessboard. The Soviet Union was spreading across Eastern Europe like spilled ink, and everyone in Washington was getting nervous. The French played their trump card brilliantly. They told America, if you don't help us keep our colonies, we might just have to cozy up to the Soviets. It was diplomatic blackmail at its finest, and it worked like a charm. So America, the nation that had literally fought a war against colonial rule, found itself bankrolling France's attempt to recolonize Vietnam. The irony wasn't lost on Ho Chi Minh, who must have wondered what happened to his American friends. Enter the domino theory. The idea that if one country fell to communism, others would follow like a line of dominoes. It was simple, catchy, and completely ignored the fact that countries aren't actually dominoes. But it sounded scary enough to justify just about any military action. When North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, America sent troops and successfully pushed them back. This victory made everyone in Washington think, hey, we can contain communism in Asia. This is easy. Famous last words, as they say. The French, armed with American aid and supreme confidence, had been fighting in Vietnam for 7 years by 1953. They'd lost over 100,000 men, but still believed they could win. They decided to set up a fortified base at Dien Bien Phu, confident that any confrontation would result in a French victory. Their confidence was so high, they didn't even bother securing the jungle-covered hills overlooking their 11,000 men. That's like building a fortress and forgetting to check if your enemies have the high ground. Spoiler alert, they did. 50,000 Vietnamese soldiers surrounded the valley and began a 55-day bombardment that turned the French base into Swiss cheese. When the French finally surrendered, they'd lost 8,000 troops and their entire colonial empire in Southeast Asia. Ho Chi Minh's forces had just proven they could beat a major Western power. That victory changed everything. The Geneva Accords split Vietnam along the 17th parallel, creating North and South Vietnam with a demilitarized zone in between. It was supposed to be temporary, like those temporary tax increases that somehow become permanent. About 900,000 people fled south, seeking life without communism. The South became the Republic of Vietnam, with Ngo Dinh Diem as president, while the North became Ho Chi Minh's communist stronghold. But here's the thing about temporary divisions. They have a habit of becoming very permanent, very quickly. John F. Kennedy inherited this mess in 1961, along with Cold War tensions that were hotter than a jalapeno's armpit. Everyone expected him to be tough on communism, especially after he'd failed to stop the Berlin Wall and communist expansion in Laos and Cambodia. Kennedy's advisors kept telling him to send ground troops to Vietnam. Vietnam can't fall to communism, they insisted. But Kennedy, perhaps sensing the quicksand ahead, refused to send troops. Instead, he sent military advisors, Green Berets, helicopters, and funding. He also authorized the use of napalm and Agent Orange to deny cover to the Vietcong. These chemical weapons would leave scars on Vietnam's landscape and people that lasted decades. Sometimes the cure really is worse than the disease. South Vietnam's President Diem had a problem. He was Catholic, ruling a predominantly Buddhist country, and he wasn't exactly tolerant of religious differences. The situation got so bad that a 73-year-old Buddhist monk set himself on fire in protest while a silent crowd watched. Other monks followed suit, turning themselves into martyrs while the world watched in horror. Instead of addressing the religious persecution, Diem imposed martial law and arrested protesters. The democracy America was supposedly protecting had become a dictatorship. Vietnamese generals, with American blessing, assassinated Diem and his brother in November 1963. People celebrated in the streets, but their joy was short-lived. 3 weeks later, Kennedy himself was assassinated, and Lyndon B. Johnson inherited the Vietnam problem. Johnson had opposed the coup against Diem, fearing it would make things worse. He was right. With Diem gone, South Vietnam went through 8 different governments between January 1964 and June 1965. It was like musical chairs, except the music never stopped and everyone kept falling down. The Viet Cong saw this chaos as an opportunity and ramped up their attacks throughout the countryside. Each new government was weaker than the last, and America found itself propping up a house of cards in a hurricane. On a quiet day in the Gulf of Tonkin, the USS Maddox was doing what American ships do, cruising around and keeping an eye on things. North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked, and Ho Chi Minh was reportedly shocked by his Navy's aggression. He even removed the officer responsible for being too impulsive. Johnson's advisors urged retaliation, but the president said he'd need a second attack to justify military action. Here's where things get interesting. That second attack probably never happened. Sonar operators convinced themselves they'd detected another attack, but it was about as real as a unicorn riding a bicycle. Based on this probable attack, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving Johnson authority to use military force in Southeast Asia. America went to war over an incident that probably didn't happen. You can't make this stuff up. After Viet Cong attacks killed American advisors, Johnson launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a systematic bombing campaign designed to bomb North Vietnam into submission. The president kept this escalation secret from the American public because, apparently, honesty about war is optional. The bombing continued for years, dropping more explosives on the Ho Chi Minh Trail alone than were dropped on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. Yet somehow, the supplies kept flowing south. It turns out you can't bomb a jungle path into permanent submission. In March 1965, Johnson finally did what he'd sworn he wouldn't do. He sent ground troops to Vietnam. As the Pentagon Papers later revealed, it wasn't to stop communism. It was to avoid the humiliation of admitting the whole thing was a mistake. By 1966, over 200,000 American troops were stationed in Vietnam, and the Viet Cong controlled 3/4 of the South Vietnamese countryside. The more troops America sent, the more the situation seemed to deteriorate. American soldiers found themselves fighting not just the Vietnamese, but Vietnam itself. The jungle was like a living nightmare. Elephant grass that cut like razor blades, bamboo towers 20 meters tall, and vegetation so thick it took an hour to move 100 feet. Finger-long black leeches attached themselves to soldiers, creating wounds that quickly became infected. Booby traps and landmines littered the terrain like deadly Easter eggs. And the M16 rifles had a nasty habit of jamming during firefights, often at the worst possible moments. Despite winning most battles, American victories felt meaningless. Enemy soldiers were replaced faster than you could count them, and any territory captured was quickly retaken once American forces moved on. It was like playing whack-a-mole with deadly consequences. By early 1968, 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam, and leaders promised victory was just around the corner. There was supposedly light at the end of the tunnel. That light turned out to be an oncoming train. On January 31, 1968, the first day of Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, 84,000 Vietcong guerrillas and North Vietnamese soldiers launched coordinated attacks on 36 provincial capitals, dozens of military bases, and 6 major cities. For the first time, Americans could see their enemy clearly. The Viet Cong were fighting in the streets instead of hiding in the jungle, playing America's type of warfare, and America was winning militarily. Johnson claimed the Tet Offensive was a devastating defeat for the communists. Of the 84,000 enemy troops involved, 58,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. By any military measure, it was an overwhelming American victory. But there was one small problem: the American public. Vietnam was the first television war, bringing combat footage directly into American living rooms. For months, the public had been told the war was nearly over, that victory was in sight, that the North Vietnamese were on their last legs. Then Tet happened, and suddenly the defeated enemy was attacking everywhere at once. The disconnect between official statements and televised reality shattered public trust in the government. The military might have won the battle, but they lost the war for American hearts and minds. Protesters flooded the streets. On March 31, 1968, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election and would halt bombing of North Vietnam to encourage peace talks. The nation was stunned. As the 1968 election approached, Johnson was making real progress toward peace. North Vietnam had agreed to talks with South Vietnam, and the US had agreed to include the Viet Cong in negotiations. Peace seemed within reach. Then, 3 days before the election, South Vietnam's President Thieu unexpectedly withdrew from the peace talks. Unknown to the public, a representative of Nixon's campaign had secretly contacted Thieu, promising better terms if Nixon won the election. Johnson knew about Nixon's sabotage, but couldn't reveal it without exposing intelligence sources. Nixon's secret remained safe. The peace talks collapsed, and American soldiers continued dying for political gain. The darkest chapter came when news broke of the My Lai massacre. American soldiers had slaughtered over 500 innocent Vietnamese civilians, men, women, and children, in a small village. The images shocked the world and destroyed any remaining moral authority America claimed in Vietnam. Anti-war protests reached new heights. Hundreds of thousands took to the streets across the country. The war that began with good intentions had become a nightmare that seemed to corrupt everyone it touched. Nixon introduced Vietnamization, gradually turning the fighting over to South Vietnamese forces while slowly withdrawing American troops. It sounded better than "we're cutting and running," but that's essentially what it was. On September 2, 1969, the 24th anniversary of Ho Chi Minh's Declaration of Independence, Ho Chi Minh died. He never lived to see his unified Vietnam, but his dream was about to become reality. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March 1973, leaving only 200 Marines to guard the embassy and other buildings. Nixon had promised South Vietnam that American air power would return if needed, but when push came to shove, America was done with Vietnam. In April 1975, North Vietnamese forces surrounded Saigon. President Thieu resigned and fled the country. On April 29th, the final evacuation began. Operation Frequent Wind. Helicopters ferried people from the American embassy roof to ships offshore in one of the most iconic images of American defeat. When the ships were full, helicopters were literally pushed into the ocean to make room for more evacuees. Saigon fell on April 30th, 1975. The war that had consumed 2 decades, millions of lives, and America's confidence in itself was finally over. More than 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. Over 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers perished. More than 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers and Vietcong guerrillas lost their lives. Over 2 million civilians from both sides died, along with thousands more from Laos and Cambodia. South Vietnam's economy was nationalized along strict communist lines, leading to economic disaster. Living standards plummeted and people starved. About 1.5 million Vietnamese eventually fled their homeland, with 400,000 making it to America as refugees. The war that was supposed to prevent communist takeover of South Vietnam ended with exactly that outcome. The domino theory proved wrong. Neighboring countries didn't fall like dominoes, and communist Vietnam eventually became a trading partner with the United States. The Vietnam War brought everything into question: the morality of destroying villages to save them, the meaning of free-fire zones where soldiers shot anything that moved, and America's role as world policeman. But perhaps the most important lesson was this: good intentions aren't enough. Military might can't solve political problems, and sometimes the best thing a superpower can do is admit it made a mistake and walk away. The soldiers who fought and died on all sides, American, North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, and Viet Cong, weren't responsible for the political decisions that sent them to war. They showed courage and sacrifice in service to their countries, and they shouldn't be forgotten. Vietnam changed both America and Vietnam forever. It ended America's sense of invincibility and taught a painful lesson about the limits of military power. For Vietnam, it brought the independence Ho Chi Minh had dreamed of, but at a cost that no victory could justify. The war that began with a petition in Paris ended with helicopters falling into the South China Sea. Between those two moments lay one of the most tragic and unnecessary conflicts in human history. A war that everyone thought they were fighting for the right reasons, but nobody could agree on what those reasons actually were. If this deep dive into history opened your eyes to new perspectives, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories. Share this with friends who love history. Together we can keep these important lessons alive. What other historical events would you like us to explore? Drop your suggestions in the comments below.